In 1942, this aircraft was a disappointment, until one secret engine change turned it into the most feared fighter in the sky. In the early months of 1940, while Europe burned and Britain fought for survival, an American aircraft company named North American Aviation rushed to design a fighter that barely anyone had asked for. The British, desperate for planes, had turned to the United States with an urgent plea. Can you build us something, anything, that flies faster than a Spitfire? The result was the NA-73X, the prototype that would become the P-51 Mustang. In just 117 days, an almost impossible feat, the engineers built the first model from scratch. Its sleek fuselage and laminar flow wings promised speed and agility beyond imagination. On paper, it looked revolutionary. But when the first Mustangs took to the skies in 1941, reality hit hard. The Mustang was beautiful, but slow where it mattered most. The Allison V1710 engine, though reliable and smooth, gasped for power above 15,000 feet. At higher altitudes, the very arena where the air war over Europe raged, the engine's performance plummeted. The Spitfires could climb, the Messerschmitts could chase. But the Mustang? It fell behind. The U.S. Army Air Forces didn't know what to do with it. It wasn't terrible, just mediocre. It flew low-level reconnaissance, strafing, and ground attack missions. Pilots called it good at everything, great at nothing. In Britain, RAF pilots respected its handling but lamented its weakness where it mattered most: escorting bombers through German skies. By 1942, the Mustang seemed destined to become another forgotten aircraft, a footnote in a war overflowing with mechanical legends. The Army ordered more P-47 Thunderbolts. The RAF doubled down on Spitfires and Typhoons. And in a quiet North American hangar in California, workers built planes that few believed would change the course of history. But across the Atlantic, in a Rolls-Royce test facility tucked deep inside the British countryside, a handful of engineers were thinking differently. They saw potential in the Mustang's graceful airframe, potential trapped beneath an underpowered heart. And as they stared at the sleek American design, one of them reportedly muttered, "Give this bird a Merlin engine, and she'll dance with angels." That single idea, half experiment, half act of rebellion, was about to spark one of the greatest transformations in aviation history. It began quietly, no orders, no headlines, just a small group of British engineers who refused to let a good idea die. In the summer of 1942, deep inside Rolls-Royce's experimental division at Hucknall, a few test pilots and mechanics began working after hours on what many in the Air Ministry considered a pointless exercise. Their goal? To see what would happen if they took the American Mustang airframe and replaced its Allison engine with the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin, the same power plant that roared inside the Spitfire Mark IX and Lancaster bomber. On paper, it was madness. The Merlin engine was larger, heavier, and ran hotter than the Allison. Mounting it meant redesigning the engine mounts, fuel lines, cooling systems, and even the cowlings. The aircraft's center of gravity would shift. Balance could be ruined. But the British team, led by engineer Ronald Harker and test pilot Ronald Shepard, believed it could work. Harker had flown the original Mustang and had been stunned by its aerodynamic efficiency. "It only needs a proper engine," he wrote in a memo to Rolls-Royce headquarters. They began modifying one of the early Mustangs, serial AM-121, stripping it down and fitting the Merlin 61 engine. It took weeks of cutting, welding, and guesswork. There was no manual, no official permission. It was a wartime gamble, born of desperation and intuition. By October 1942, the experimental aircraft, unofficially dubbed the Mustang X, was ready for flight. Test pilot Ronald Shepard climbed into the cockpit, heart pounding, knowing that the entire project was technically unsanctioned. Mechanics watched from the grass as the Merlin-powered Mustang taxied forward, its propeller growling with a new, deeper tone. The takeoff was smooth, almost anticlimactic. But when Shepard climbed above 15,000 feet, the difference became unmistakable. The plane didn't choke, it thrived. The altimeter spun faster, the engine roared cleanly, and the airspeed indicator edged past 440 miles per hour, a speed that rivaled even the best Spitfires. When Shepard landed, he simply grinned. The experiment had worked, beyond all expectations. One witness later said, "The Mustang had been reborn. It was no longer a good airplane, it was a great one." Word spread fast through the corridors of Rolls-Royce and the RAF. For the first time, engineers began to believe that the Allies had something truly special. A fighter that could fly farther, faster, and higher than anything else in the sky. But across the Atlantic, the Americans weren't convinced. Not yet. North American aviation had heard the rumors of a British modification, but many saw it as a sideshow. It would take a few more tests and one bold transatlantic decision to bring the Mustang's full power to life. By the winter of 1942, the British had proven the impossible. But proof alone wasn't enough to win a war. Across the Atlantic, the engineers at North American Aviation in California still viewed the Merlin-powered Mustang as a curious British experiment, not a blueprint for mass production. That changed when U.S. Army Air Force's test pilot Bob Chilton took the controls of the modified aircraft. He returned speechless, then laughing. The numbers didn't lie. The Merlin Mustang climbed faster than any American fighter, outpaced every German aircraft then in service, and could sustain its power well above 25,000 feet, where bombers desperately needed protection. The Americans couldn't ignore it any longer. The reports from Rolls-Royce, the RAF, and the U.S. observers all said the same thing. The combination of the North American airframe and the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine results in an aircraft of outstanding performance. North American's chief engineer, Edgar Schmuid, immediately got to work. He was a quiet Austrian-born designer who believed in simplicity and strength. And when he saw the test data, he knew it was time to act. Working alongside the Packard Motor Company of Detroit, Schmuid and his team began adapting the Mustang to fit the American-built version of the Merlin, the Packard 51650-3. It wasn't just an engine swap, it was an engineering overhaul. The cooling system had to be redesigned with a new intercooler, the fuselage reinforced, the propeller replaced with a 4-blade Hamilton Standard. Engineers fine-tuned the laminar flow wings, adjusting the leading edges to improve airflow at high speeds. The result was breathtaking. The new Mustang, now designated P-51B, achieved 437 miles per hour at 25,000 feet and could climb to 30,000 in minutes. More importantly, it had an operational range of over 1,500 miles with drop tanks, enough to escort Allied bombers deep into Germany and back. When test pilot Chilton flew the first American-built Merlin Mustang in December 1942, he reportedly shouted into his radio, "This thing climbs like a homesick angel." The transformation was complete. What began as a good-enough aircraft had evolved into one of the finest fighters ever built, a perfect balance of speed, range, and power. But the Mustang's true purpose was only beginning to emerge. While engineers celebrated on the test fields of California, the skies over Europe told a darker story. Allied bombers were being slaughtered at a horrifying rate. The Luftwaffe's fighters owned the air above Germany, and no Allied escort could reach them. That was about to change. In early 1943, while the war raged over Europe, American factories thundered day and night. Bombers were rolling off assembly lines by the thousands, but every mission deeper into Germany was a bloodletting. Without long-range escorts, the 8th Air Force lost hundreds of men each month. Crews called it the death zone, the point beyond which their P-47 Thunderbolts or Spitfires couldn't follow. In response, General Henry Hap Arnold, the commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, turned his attention to the new Merlin-powered Mustang. The British had proven it worked. Now, America had to mass produce it. And fast. The Packard Motor Company of Detroit, already known for its luxury cars, began producing licensed Rolls-Royce Merlin engines under the designation V1650. These engines weren't simple copies. They were redesigned for American production standards using domestic materials and new tooling. Packard's engineers worked around the clock, combining Detroit's automotive precision with British aerospace ingenuity. At North American's Inglewood plant, engineers led by Edgar Schmude reworked the airframe into a refined, deadly version, the P-51B and later P-51C. The Mustang's elegant shape now concealed the most efficient engine-airframe pairing of the war. Every bolt, every curve had a purpose. Its sleek laminar flow wings cut drag to almost nothing, while its radiator system, originally seen as a weakness, was now tuned to generate a small amount of thrust through heat compression. By late 1943, production lines were roaring. Test pilots described the new Mustang as alive, responsive, and brutally fast. It could outrun a Messerschmitt Bf-109, outclimb an FW-190, and, thanks to its range, outlast them all. For the first time, the Allies had a fighter that could accompany bombers from England to Berlin and back again. Still, not everyone was convinced. Some senior officers doubted that a new plane could turn the tide of the air war. The P-47 had thicker armor. The Spitfire had prestige. The Mustang was still the newcomer, a foreign-born hybrid, half American, half British. But in the skies above Europe, where the air was thin and the bombers flew home burning, the crews didn't care about politics. They needed protection. And as the first Merlin Mustangs arrived in England in December 1943, a new kind of hope followed them across the Atlantic. For the first time, the 8th Air Force had a fighter that could go the distance, a machine forged from two nations' genius and a shared desperation to end the slaughter. The Mustang's legend was about to be written not in factories or test reports, but in contrails stretching across the gray skies of Germany. By early 1944, the skies over Europe were changing. For months, the Luftwaffe had ruled the high-altitude corridors where Allied bombers flew. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and AW-190s attacked in packs, tearing through bomber formations, leaving flaming wrecks across the countryside. But now, for the first time, a new silhouette began to appear high above the bombers. Sleek, long-nosed, and impossibly fast. It was the P-51B Mustang, armed with 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns and powered by the Packard-built Merlin engine. To the German pilots, it seemed to come from nowhere, diving from the sun with terrifying speed and then vanishing before they could react. Its pilots called it the Cadillac of the skies. The difference was immediate and brutal. Allied bomber losses, which had been catastrophic through late 1943, began to drop sharply once Mustang escorts appeared. Their endurance was astonishing. Mustangs could take off from England, fly hundreds of miles across occupied Europe, escort bombers all the way to Berlin, and still have fuel to dogfight. The Luftwaffe had never faced a fighter that could reach them at home. Pilots like Don Gentile, John Godfrey, and George Preddy became household names. Their squadrons painted the noses of their Mustangs in bright colors, red, yellow, blue, so bomber crews could spot them and cheer. When those colors appeared in formation, it meant someone was watching their backs. One bomber pilot wrote in his journal, "When the Mustangs joined up with us over Germany, you could almost hear the sigh go through the whole formation." We knew we might make it home. The Luftwaffe's seasoned aces tried to adapt. They climbed higher, attacked from above, and relied on experience. But the Mustang's combination of range, speed, and agility left little room for error. The German fighter arm, already drained by years of combat, began to bleed out. Everywhere the Mustangs went, they changed the rhythm of the air war. Escort missions became offensive sweeps. Defensive flights turned into hunts. American pilots began targeting Luftwaffe bases, fuel depots, and trains, striking deep inside Germany's heartland. The once invincible enemy now found itself on the defensive. The Mustang wasn't just another fighter. It was a statement, a machine that symbolized Allied cooperation and industrial might. Born of British ingenuity and American muscle, it was engineered perfection with a conscience. But victory in the air was never simple. As the Mustang began to tip the balance, bomber crews faced new orders. Push deeper, strike harder, leave nothing untouched. The air war had entered its most violent phase, and the P-51 was now leading the charge. By the spring of 1944, the Mustang was no longer an experiment or a hope. It was a weapon of transformation. When P-51 squadrons joined the long-range missions into Germany, everything about the air war changed. The bombers were no longer flying alone into slaughter. They had guardians, fast and relentless, who could follow them all the way to their targets and home again. Before the Mustang, American bomber crews had faced near-certain death beyond the Rhine. The Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader, elite fighter wings, would swarm unescorted formations, destroying dozens of B-17s and B-24s in a single mission. Losses sometimes reached 25% in one day. But with the P-51 now slicing through the upper altitudes, the hunters became the hunted. The turning point came during the massive air campaigns of Big Week in February 1944. Hundreds of Mustangs escorted bomber streams deep into Germany, striking aircraft factories in Leipzig, Regensburg, and Brunswick. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the sky. Dogfights erupted at 30,000 feet, twisting contrails marking the chaos. Yet for every bomber that fell, another made it home, shielded by the Mustangs weaving above. Veteran German ace Adolf Galland would later admit, "The day the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, the war was lost." It wasn't hyperbole. With the new escorts, the Allies could finally attack Germany's industrial heartlands without unacceptable losses. Factories, oil refineries, and rail lines, the arteries of the Nazi war machine, came under relentless pressure. The Mustang pilots themselves flew punishing missions, 6 or 7 hours long, often in freezing cockpits at altitudes where the air itself seemed to freeze. They fought fatigue, oxygen starvation, and the constant threat of ambush. Yet their kill ratios soared. Some pilots claimed 5 victories in a single mission. And when P-51s reached the skies above Berlin for the first time in March 1944, bomber crews could scarcely believe it. They cheered over the radios as silver Mustangs darted ahead to clear the path. The mission wasn't flawless. Many aircraft still went down. But something fundamental had shifted. The Luftwaffe could no longer dictate when or where to fight. As months passed, the German defenses grew thinner. Shortages of fuel, pilots, and aircraft crippled their once formidable fighter arm. The Mustangs kept coming, escorting not just bombers but now leading fighter sweeps, attacking enemy airfields before the German planes could even take off. By the time the Normandy invasion approached, the Allies held something priceless: complete air superiority over Western Europe. And that supremacy rested in large part on the slender wings and roaring Merlin heart of the P-51 Mustang. By mid-1944, the once mighty Luftwaffe, the terror of Europe's skies, was dying on its feet. Its decline hadn't come suddenly, but like a steady bleed that no amount of skill or courage could stop. The P-51 Mustang had become a hunter of hunters, a machine that changed the rhythm of the air war and shattered the myth of German air supremacy. Everywhere the Luftwaffe turned, the Mustangs were waiting. They struck German formations before they reached the bombers, diving from impossible altitudes, their 4.50 caliber guns spitting fire. When enemy fighters tried to retreat, the Mustangs followed them home, attacking airfields, fuel depots, and even pilots on the ground. The Luftwaffe could no longer rest, even behind its own lines. In April 1944, Allied fighters destroyed more than 1,000 German aircraft in a single month. Training squadrons, once safe deep in Bavaria, were now being hunted. Young German pilots, some barely out of school, were thrown into combat with only a few hours of flight time. Facing veteran Mustang aces, they rarely survived their first mission. Fuel shortages worsened the crisis. Allied bombing of synthetic oil plants left the Luftwaffe scrambling. Many German fighters were grounded before they even took off, their tanks empty. Engineers resorted to desperate measures, draining fuel from trucks and reserve stores. Aces like Erich Hartmann and Gerhard Barkhorn continued to score victories, but even they admitted the war was slipping away. Meanwhile, the Mustangs multiplied. By the summer of 1944, hundreds filled the skies daily. Escort groups like the 4th, 352nd, and 357th Fighter Groups claimed astonishing tallies. Major George Preddy alone shot down 27 German aircraft before the war's end. Others, like Chuck Yeager, honed the skills that would later break the sound barrier. The Luftwaffe tried one last gamble, the Me-262 jet fighter, faster than anything in the air. But it came too late, built in too few numbers, and hounded on the ground by Mustang attacks before it could change the outcome. The Mustangs even destroyed jets during takeoff, exploiting their slow acceleration. By late 1944, the air over Germany belonged to the Allies. The 8th Air Force, once decimated on deep raids, now struck with near impunity. The Luftwaffe that had once terrorized London, Warsaw, and Stalingrad was broken, its remnants scattered across smoking airfields. One Luftwaffe officer later wrote, "When we heard the bombers coming, we listened for the engines behind them. If they were Mustangs, we knew our day would be short. The P-51 hadn't just won duels in the air, it had strangled the Luftwaffe's ability to fight at all. The final chapter of the air war was written in contrails and smoke, and it carried the Mustang's signature across the skies of a dying Reich. When the war in Europe finally ended in May 1945, the skies fell silent. Airfields that had once thundered with engines and echoed with radio chatter now stood quiet, littered with the wrecks of machines that had ruled, fought, and fallen. Among the victors stood one aircraft above all others, the P-51 Mustang, sleek, scarred, and unchallenged. The statistics told only part of the story. Mustang pilots had destroyed nearly 5,000 enemy aircraft in the air, more than any other Allied fighter type. Their long-range escort missions allowed bombers to strike deep into Germany's heartland and return with losses that were finally bearable. The Mustang hadn't just protected crews, it had enabled the entire Allied air strategy to succeed. But numbers alone couldn't explain its legend. What made the Mustang unforgettable was how it came to be. A story of cooperation between nations at a time when the world was tearing itself apart. An American airframe, a British engine, a shared determination to survive. The combination was never planned, yet it became the symbol of unity in the fight for freedom. When peace returned, Mustangs continued to serve in new wars and new skies. From the Korean War to the air races of post-war America. Others were sold to nations rebuilding their air forces, flying under new flags, but carrying the same heart, the Merlin that had once sung over Berlin. Today, the sound of a Mustang engine still turns heads at every air show. It's more than nostalgia. It's recognition of what human ingenuity can achieve under impossible pressure. What began as a mediocre design transformed, through one simple act of cross-innovation, into the most iconic fighter of the 20th century. The Mustang's story isn't just about metal, fuel, and speed. It's about vision, the courage to look at something ordinary and see what it could become. In 1942, a few British engineers and American designers dared to believe that if you gave a good idea a second chance, it might just save the world. And in the end, they were right. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more true World War II documentaries that uncover the real stories behind the machines, battles, and heroes that changed history. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Every week, we bring you fact-checked, cinematic history that goes beyond the textbooks.